The sea remembers everything. The cries of dying empires, the thunder of cannons, the silence of men who became legends. But some stories sink so deep they almost disappear. 4 centuries ago, the mightiest empire the world had ever seen ruled the waves. An empire built on gold, blood, and faith. The Spanish Empire. They called the Caribbean Mare Nostrum, our sea. No ship sailed those waters without their blessing, or their fear. Spain's fleets carried silver from Peru, gold from Mexico, and treasures from the New World. It was a lifeline that fueled the Spanish crown and financed its wars in Europe. Each month, vast treasure galleons sailed from the colonies to Seville, guarded by warships, fortified ports, and the authority of the church itself. To attack them was to defy God and king both. And yet, in 1668, one man would do exactly that. Not a king, not a noble, a pirate from Wales, whose name would one day be whispered as both a curse and a legend. Henry Morgan. The 17th century was an age of empire, but also an age of chaos. Spain was bleeding. Its golden age, born from the conquests of Cortés and Pizarro, had begun to rot under its own weight. War with France, rivalries with England and the Dutch Republic. And in the Caribbean, rebellion. Other nations wanted their share of the New World's riches. The English crown had seized Jamaica from Spain in 1655 and turned the island into a fortress, a pirate haven, and a staging ground for privateers. The English governor at Port Royal began issuing letters of marque, official licenses that allowed sailors to attack Spanish ships in the name of the crown. In reality, it was a thin veil of legality over pure piracy. They called it privateering. The Spanish called it heresy. And among the cutthroats, deserters, and fortune-seekers of Port Royal, one young man was rising faster than any other. Henry Morgan was born around 1635 in the rolling farmlands of Monmouthshire, Wales, a land of mist, coal, and quiet ambition. His early life is a mystery. Some say he was kidnapped and sold into service in the Caribbean. Others claim he volunteered, chasing fortune where no Welshman had before. What's certain is this. By his mid-20s, he had become one of the most daring privateers in the Caribbean. He fought under the English Admiral Christopher Mings, a man known for his savage raids on Spanish settlements. Morgan learned from him how to strike fast, vanish faster, and use terror as a weapon. But while others fought for loot, Morgan fought for something more dangerous. Reputation. He was charismatic, brutal, and methodical, a rare mind in a chaotic world. He studied his enemies' defenses, their routines, their faith. He knew the Spanish believed their fortresses were untouchable, and that arrogance would become his greatest weapon. By 1668, Port Royal was the richest, most lawless city in the New World, a city of brothels, rum, and gold, where pirates spent their spoils faster than they could steal them. But it was also a city of politics. The governor of Jamaica, Sir Thomas Modiford, wanted to strengthen England's grip on the Caribbean. Officially, England was at peace with Spain. Unofficially, Modiford knew that peace was bad for business. And so, when Morgan proposed an expedition, a strike against the Spanish port of Portobello, one of Spain's richest coastal cities in modern-day Panama, Modiford didn't refuse. He simply didn't write it down. What Morgan planned was madness. Portobello wasn't a village or a trading post, it was a fortress. Protected by 3 castles, heavy guns, and a garrison of soldiers who had never been defeated. It was one of the main arteries of Spain's treasure network, the place where Peruvian silver met the Atlantic. To attack it with pirates was suicide, but Henry Morgan understood something the Spanish didn't. Fortresses are built to repel armies, not ghosts. Before dawn in late June of 1668, Morgan's fleet, just 9 ships and around 460 men, slipped out of Port Royal. They sailed silently east, hugging the Jamaican coast, avoiding Spanish patrols. For nearly 2 weeks they vanished into the sea. Then, under cover of darkness, they struck. Morgan's men landed 3 miles from Portobello and advanced through the jungle. By dawn, they had surrounded the first Spanish fortress, Santiago Castle. The guards barely had time to load their muskets. Morgan's men stormed the walls with ladders, grenades, and cutlasses. In an hour, the first castle fell, the second fortress followed by noon, the third by nightfall. When the Spanish commander refused to surrender, Morgan ordered a terrifying bluff. He used captured monks and nuns as human shields, forcing the defenders to choose between surrender and sacrilege. By the next day, Portobello belonged to the pirates. The Spanish governor of Panama couldn't believe the news. An entire fortified city, taken by a handful of men. He called it the greatest insult ever delivered to His Majesty. But the humiliation didn't end there. Morgan demanded a ransom of 100,000 pesos to spare the city from destruction. When the ransom was paid, he still looted everything, churches, homes, and garrisons, before setting sail for Jamaica, unchallenged. Spain's empire wasn't invincible. Its garrisons, its faith, and its fleets could be broken by a pirate. When Morgan returned to Port Royal, he was celebrated as a hero. His share of the loot made him one of the richest men in the Caribbean. But more importantly, his name spread like wildfire. To the Spanish, he was El Diablo Inglés, the English devil. To the English, he was a weapon. The Spanish Empire, humiliated and enraged, began fortifying every port in the New World. They increased their naval patrols, built more cannons, and sent more troops. But what they didn't realize was that their fear was already crippling them. Trade slowed, convoys were delayed, merchants refused to sail without heavy escorts, and every whisper of a pirate in the wind carried one name: Henry Morgan. Morgan had exposed the empire's weakness, not its walls or ships, but its pride. And he wasn't done yet. Because in his mind, Portobello was just the beginning. There was a city, richer, more guarded, more sacred than any other, that no pirate had ever dared to touch. A city that was said to be untouchable, Panama, and Morgan intended to burn it to the ground. When Henry Morgan returned to Jamaica, the world already knew his name. But the Spanish were not done. In Madrid, they called his attack on Portobello a sin against God himself. In London, diplomats tried to deny responsibility, and in Port Royal, the pirate city of gold and decay, men whispered of the next raid. Because Morgan wasn't satisfied with one victory, he wanted to strike at the heart of Spain's empire, where all its riches flowed together, before crossing the sea to Europe. A city hidden behind jungles and mountains, a place the Spanish called the key to the Pacific, Panama City. Morgan began assembling the largest pirate force the Caribbean had ever seen. They came from every corner of the sea: French buccaneers from Tortuga, English privateers, escaped slaves, deserters, even former Spanish soldiers. By the end of the year, more than 2,000 men had sworn to sail under Morgan's flag. His fleet grew to nearly 40 ships, from nimble sloops to war-ready frigates armed with heavy cannon. To feed and arm them, Morgan plundered nearby settlements and Spanish supply ships. The governor of Jamaica, Sir Thomas Modiford, pretended ignorance. But every coin of gold that Morgan brought back strengthened England's shadow war against Spain. The pirates didn't see themselves as rebels. They were soldiers of fortune, each convinced that God, or luck, or both, favored them. But Morgan knew something they didn't. The journey to Panama would be unlike anything the Caribbean had ever seen, because Panama wasn't on the coast. It was hidden inland, across jungles, rivers, and disease-ridden swamps. To reach it, he would have to fight not just Spain's army, but the land itself. Before turning to Panama, Morgan tested Spain's defenses again. He attacked Maracaibo on the coast of modern-day Venezuela, a rich port defended by 2 fortresses. This time, the Spanish were waiting. Their navy had trapped Morgan's ships in the bay. But Morgan was never one to die in a cage. He disguised one of his smaller ships to look like a burning wreck and sent it drifting toward the Spanish flagship. When the Spaniards approached to tow it away, the wreck exploded, a floating bomb packed with gunpowder. In seconds, flames swallowed the bay. The Spanish flagship sank with all hands. Morgan's fleet slipped through the chaos, sails full, laughing as they escaped into open sea. Once again, the impossible had happened. Spain's navy had been humiliated by a pirate who fought with cunning instead of numbers. But this victory carried a price. Spain began demanding vengeance from England. If the crown couldn't control its privateers, war might follow. Governor Modiford, terrified of being blamed, ordered Morgan to stand down. Morgan ignored him, because in his mind there was only one battle left that mattered, the one that would break Spain's spirit forever. Late in 1670, Morgan summoned his captains to Port Royal's harbor. He laid out his plan. They would sail to the Caribbean coast of Panama, capture the Spanish fortress of San Lorenzo, then march through the jungle to Panama City on the Pacific side. It was madness, a march of over 160 kilometers through disease, heat, and enemy territory. But Morgan knew something the Spanish didn't. He had spies, informants in Cartagena, Portobelo, and even Panama itself. He knew the garrison was weak. He knew the governor had grown complacent. And he knew that the Spanish were still terrified of his name. The captains argued. Some wanted to raid Havana instead, or the Yucatan. But Morgan's voice cut through the room like a blade. Gentlemen, if we take Panama, we take the empire's heart. The sea will belong to us. By dawn, they had agreed. The largest pirate expedition in history was born. January 1671. Morgan's armada appeared off the coast of Panama. At the mouth of the Chagres River stood Fort San Lorenzo, the gatekeeper of Panama's inland route. Its cannons watched over the sea, its soldiers over the jungle. Morgan's men attacked at night. Scaling the cliffs, they fought hand to hand for hours. The Spanish defenders set fire to their own powder magazine, rather than surrender. The explosion shattered the fortress walls. When the smoke cleared, San Lorenzo was Morgan's. From there, Morgan assembled 1,400 men and began the march inland. For 9 days, they moved through nightmare. The jungles were thick with rain and insects. Their food ran out. Men collapsed from hunger and fever. Spanish scouts harassed them from the shadows, shooting and disappearing into the trees. They boiled leather for soup. They drank muddy river water. Some began to whisper that the sea had abandoned them. But Morgan pressed on, his eyes fixed on one thing, Panama. Finally, on January 27, 1671, from a ridge overlooking the valley, they saw it. A city shining in the distance, domes of gold, white stone towers, and the Pacific beyond. Panama. At dawn the next day, the Spanish army, nearly 2,000 strong, marched out to meet the pirates. They brought cavalry, militia, and even herds of cattle, which they hoped to drive into Morgan's lines to break their ranks. Morgan waited until the Spaniards were close. Then he ordered his men to fire. The first volley tore through the Spanish front. The cattle panicked, charging back into their own troops. Within minutes, the battlefield was chaos, smoke, screams, and thunder. By noon, the Spanish army had collapsed. Panama City lay undefended. Morgan's men entered the city and looted everything they could carry: gold, silver, silks, pearls, even church bells. When a fire broke out, some say by accident, others say by design, the city burned for days. By the time the flames died, Panama, once the richest city in the New World, was nothing but ash. News of the disaster reached Spain months later. The king was furious. How could one pirate, one outlaw, destroy an entire fleet, a fortress, a city? The Spanish Navy had been crippled, their Pacific trade halted, and their grip on the Caribbean loosened forever. Morgan had achieved what no admiral could. He had broken the empire's illusion of control. But even as his legend grew, so did the shadow chasing him. When Morgan returned to Jamaica, he expected glory. Instead, he found politics. England and Spain had just signed a new peace treaty, the Treaty of Madrid, making his attack on Panama technically illegal. Governor Modiford was arrested. Morgan, too, was summoned to England, in chains. The pirate who had crippled an empire now faced judgment by the very empire that had created him. But England was a nation built on pragmatism and profit. The crown had seen how much wealth Morgan brought, how much fear he spread. So instead of execution, they gave him a title, Sir Henry Morgan, Knight of the Realm and later Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. The pirate became the law. By the time he died in 1688, Henry Morgan had become a symbol of two worlds, the ruthless age of piracy and the beginning of global empires. Spain never fully recovered its dominance in the Caribbean. Its fleets remained cautious, its ports heavily fortified, its wealth flowing slower. One pirate had changed the balance of power, not through numbers or nobility, but through audacity. The empire never expected one man to cripple its navy. But that's the truth of history. Empires fall not to armies, but to people who dare to believe they can. And on the day Henry Morgan died, the sea was calm, as if it too was remembering. After the sack of Panama, the world reeled. Reports reached Europe slowly, carried by ships that had drifted through storm and rumor alike. By the time word reached Madrid, the Spanish court was in shock. Panama, the jewel of the Pacific, the very artery through which the empire's silver and gold passed, was gone. An entire city, burned, plundered, erased. For the Spanish crown, it was not just a military defeat, it was humiliation. For over a century, the empire had ruled the Americas as if by divine right. Its fleets, escorted by galleons bristling with cannon, carried wealth beyond imagination from the New World to Seville. Its governors ruled through fear, its soldiers through faith. Yet all of that had been undone by a man who did not even claim to represent a nation. A Welsh privateer who began his life as a farm boy and ended up commanding an army of thieves. Henry Morgan's march through the Isthmus of Panama had proven that Spain's colonial structure, once considered unassailable, was fragile when pressed by audacity and chaos. His victory revealed the truth. Spain's empire was vast, but it was hollow. The sheer size of its dominion made it vulnerable to men who understood how to exploit distance, corruption, and complacency. In the months following the destruction of Panama, Spanish fleets doubled their patrols. Fortresses were rebuilt, commanders replaced, spies dispatched across the Caribbean. But none of it mattered. The psychological damage was done. Merchants refused to sail. Governors demanded more soldiers from Madrid that would never come. Entire trade routes were rerouted to avoid the shadow of Morgan. Meanwhile, in the English colonies, Morgan returned not as a fugitive, but as a legend. Port Royal erupted in celebration when his ships appeared on the horizon. His fleet limped into harbor battered but rich, gold, pearls, and silver coins spilling across the docks. His men, scarred and starving, were greeted as heroes. The taverns filled with songs about the sack of Panama, embellished with every retelling until fact and myth became indistinguishable. But the triumph could not hide the danger. While Morgan was being toasted in Jamaica, envoys from Spain were already on their way to London, demanding justice. England and Spain had just signed the Treaty of Madrid, formally ending hostilities in the Caribbean. On paper, Morgan's raid had violated it. The Spanish ambassador called it an act of piracy, so grave that it endangered peace between Christian nations. The English crown found itself in a bind. Publicly, it could not condone Morgan's actions, but privately, everyone understood that his exploits had dealt Spain a blow from which it might never recover. English merchants had long envied the riches of the Spanish Main. Now, thanks to Morgan, much of that wealth was flowing through Jamaica instead of Havana. Port Royal became the unofficial capital of England's Caribbean ambitions, a place where gold was as common as sand, and law existed only where it was profitable. The governor of Jamaica, Sir Thomas Modiford, was less fortunate. To appease Spain, London ordered his arrest. He was taken in chains back to England, accused of conspiring with pirates. When the summons came for Morgan, many assumed his fate would be the same. His enemies called him reckless, arrogant, and dangerous to diplomacy. His friends warned him that England used men like him only when convenient, and discarded them once their purpose was served. But when Morgan arrived in London in 1672, the reality was different. Instead of prison, he found himself welcomed into the circles of power. The very men who had condemned piracy were now entertaining him at banquets. The court understood that the Spanish Empire was weakening, and Morgan's campaigns had accelerated that decline. He had shown what England's navy could achieve with speed, daring, and ruthlessness. Within a year, Henry Morgan was knighted by King Charles II. The pirate became Sir Henry Morgan. A man once branded an outlaw now carried the blessings of the crown. His transformation from rogue to respectable figure symbolized a larger truth about empire. Morality was negotiable, but success was eternal. Back in Jamaica, Morgan returned as deputy governor, effectively the highest authority on the island in the governor's absence. The irony was sharp. The man who had once commanded pirates was now charged with hunting them. He enforced laws against the very crimes that had made him rich, often turning against his former allies. Some called it hypocrisy, others saw it as survival. But beneath the surface of respectability, the Caribbean was changing. Spain's presence continued to fade, its fleets harassed by corsairs and privateers from every rising power, England, France, and the Netherlands. The vacuum left by Spain's decline became the foundation of a new world order. Trade increased, colonization expanded, and the age of piracy entered its golden age. Morgan lived long enough to witness it. He saw Port Royal reach its peak, a city of merchants, adventurers, and criminals living side by side in a precarious harmony of greed. He also saw its decay. The city sank deeper into excess. Gambling dens, brothels, and taverns stretched from the waterfront to the hills. The gold that once symbolized triumph now fed corruption. In his final years, Morgan was not the man he once was. The diseases of the tropics ravaged his body. The weight of drink and age dulled his sharpness. But even then, he remained a figure of fear and fascination. Sailors swore that when Morgan walked through Port Royal's streets, men stepped aside as if a ship were passing. His presence alone commanded silence. He died in 1688 at his estate near Spanish Town and was buried with military honors. Guns thundered across the harbor as his coffin was lowered into the earth. For a moment, even the sea seemed still. But fate has its own sense of irony. 4 years later, in 1692, an earthquake struck Jamaica. Most of Port Royal, the city built on plunder, slid into the ocean. Some called it divine punishment, others poetic justice. Whatever the cause, it felt like the sea reclaiming its due. In the centuries that followed, Henry Morgan's legacy blurred. To some, he was a national hero, the man who paved the way for Britain's naval supremacy. To others, he was nothing more than a glorified thief. The Spanish never forgave him. Even now, in old colonial records, his name is written with hatred, described as the enemy of Christendom. But history is rarely written in black and white. What cannot be denied is the scale of his impact. By destroying Panama and crippling Spain's Caribbean network, Morgan changed the balance of global power. The empire that once ruled the seas with divine arrogance began its slow decline. England, learning from Morgan's tactics, built a navy that would soon dominate the world. In the end, the story of Henry Morgan is not just the story of a pirate. It is the story of how a single man's ambition intersected with the fault lines of empires. He was both a product and a symptom of his time, a century when borders were drawn in blood and morality bent under the weight of opportunity. Spain had called itself eternal, ordained by God. Yet it was undone not by a rival empire, not by rebellion, but by one man who understood that the ocean belonged to those willing to risk everything. The empire never expected one pirate to cripple its entire navy. But that's how history works. Quietly, violently, and always in the hands of those who refuse to play by its rules. In the years that followed Henry Morgan's death, the Caribbean transformed from a frontier of empires into a battleground of ideas, trade, and control. The void left by the Spanish was quickly filled by the rising maritime powers of Europe. England, France, and the Netherlands all learned the same lesson from Morgan's campaigns. Naval dominance was no longer about the size of one's fleet, but about speed, adaptability, and intelligence. Morgan's raids had exposed the fatal flaw in Spain's imperial design, a vast but inflexible system dependent on slow convoys and fortified ports. The Spanish had ruled the seas through fear and tradition. Morgan ruled through innovation and unpredictability. His victories were tactical case studies that would later shape the doctrines of privateering and colonial warfare. By proving that mobility could outwit might, Morgan had written the first chapter of what would later become modern naval strategy. For England, Morgan's success was more than symbolic. It marked the beginning of its transformation from a peripheral kingdom into a global power. Within a generation, English shipyards expanded, its colonies multiplied, and the Royal Navy evolved from scattered squadrons into a disciplined force capable of projecting power across oceans. The tactics that Morgan had used, small unit raids, amphibious assaults, and coastal strikes, became blueprints for later campaigns. When British officers studied the art of war in the 18th century, many quietly referenced the lessons of Morgan, even if his name was never formally honored. His methods appeared in the siege of Cartagena, in the defense of Jamaica, and in the English push across the Atlantic. To his contemporaries, he had been a pirate. To his successors, he was an unacknowledged strategist. Meanwhile, Spain continued its long decline. Its empire stretched from South America to the Philippines, but its resources were thinning. Silver shipments dwindled, and corruption eroded what discipline remained in its fleets. The great galleons that once terrified the Caribbean now sailed as symbols of nostalgia rather than strength. The psychological wound inflicted by Morgan's destruction of Panama never truly healed. Spanish commanders became cautious, bureaucratic, and defensive. The empire that had once expanded without hesitation began to retreat behind its walls. Historians later described this shift as the end of Spain's Age of Invincibility. From that point onward, the Caribbean became the testing ground for Britain's new imperial experiment, a fusion of trade, colonization, and naval power. The pirates and privateers who had once raided under the shadows of Morgan's flag were gradually replaced by merchants, governors, and admirals. Yet beneath the surface, the same spirit remained. Profit justified conquest, and the sea belonged to those daring enough to seize it. The morality of that legacy remains complex. Henry Morgan embodied the contradictions of empire, celebrated as a patriot in one nation, condemned as a criminal in another. His story forced later generations to confront an uncomfortable truth. History remembers success, not virtue. Morgan's sack of Panama was an atrocity by any human measure, a city burned, civilians slaughtered, and treasures stolen. Yet it was also the moment England learned that Spain could bleed. From that violence emerged a new balance of power that reshaped the world. As centuries passed, Morgan's image was rewritten many times. Romanticized ballads turned him into a swashbuckling hero. Colonial records vilified him as a monster. In Jamaica, he became a symbol of English resilience. In Spain, he was the embodiment of heresy. In popular imagination, he evolved into something larger than life, a legend standing at the threshold between myth and history. Archaeologists who later searched the ruins of Old Panama found evidence of the devastation his men had caused. Melted silver, collapsed stone, fragments of glass fused by fire. Each artifact spoke of a moment when human ambition collided with empire. The remains were mute, but they told a story more powerful than any chronicle, that the world could be changed by force of will alone. Even the sea seemed to remember him. Port Royal, the city that once celebrated his victories, sank beneath the waves in 1692, swallowed by an earthquake and a tsunami. It was as if the ocean itself had closed the chapter on the age of buccaneers. Yet Morgan's name endured. Rum bottles, ship registries, and maps continued to carry it. A strange immortality for a man who had spent his life defying the law. From a broader historical lens, Morgan's career marked a turning point in global economics. His plunder fueled not only English coffers, but also the financial systems that underpinned colonial expansion. The gold and silver taken from Spanish ports found their way into London's banks, which in turn funded exploration, trade companies, and the wars that followed. In a sense, Morgan's piracy helped lay the foundations of capitalism itself. He was an unwitting architect of an empire built not on faith or lineage, but on commerce and naval dominance. By the 1700s, England, soon to become Great Britain, controlled the Caribbean trade routes that Spain had once monopolized. The Royal Navy's presence stretched from the Bahamas to Barbados, and its ships patrolled waters where once only pirates had dared to sail. Every time a British frigate anchored in a foreign harbor, it carried with it the unspoken inheritance of Henry Morgan's audacity. Modern historians still debate the man behind the myth. Some see him as a cold pragmatist, others as a reckless opportunist. But what cannot be disputed is that he understood his era better than most. He knew that the 17th century belonged not to kings or priests, but to those who mastered the sea. The empire that never expected him, that dismissed him as a mere nuisance, ultimately learned that history bends to those who seize momentum. In the final measure, Henry Morgan's story is less about piracy than about transformation, the metamorphosis of a world order. The line between outlaw and empire blurred in his lifetime, and the consequences of that blurring still echo in modern geopolitics. The tactics of irregular warfare, the exploitation of trade routes, the use of private force for national gain, all trace faintly back to the template he set. His grave in Jamaica was lost long ago, swallowed by the same waters that consumed Port Royal. Yet his legend remains afloat, not because of his plunder, but because he embodied a paradox that defined the age. The pirate who became a knight, the criminal who built an empire's future. When historians write of the decline of Spain and the rise of Britain, they often mention treaties, battles, and monarchs. But somewhere between those pages lies the shadow of a man whose ambition crossed every line drawn by kings and laws. The empire never expected one pirate to cripple its entire navy, but it did, and the echoes of that truth still drift on every tide that touches the Caribbean, reminding the world that empires fall not from weakness alone, but from the courage, or the audacity, of a single defiant will. In the years that followed the burning of Panama, the Caribbean changed in ways few could have imagined. The Spanish Empire, once the unchallenged master of the New World, began to fracture from within. The colonies that had glittered like jewels on a royal crown became liabilities, expensive to defend, impossible to fully control. The routes that had once carried silver and gold to Seville now carried fear and rumor, whispers of English raiders, of French corsairs, of ports that could no longer be trusted. Morgan's attack had not simply destroyed a city, it had exposed a truth Spain had long refused to see, that its empire, stretched across oceans and sustained by pride, was already too vast to hold. In London, the diplomats spoke carefully. Officially, Morgan had acted without permission. Unofficially, they admired what he had accomplished. When he returned to Jamaica, he was arrested to placate Spain, but the imprisonment was brief, almost ceremonial. The Crown understood what he represented. He was not a criminal, he was an instrument, proof that England could strike deep into the Spanish heartland and win. Within 2 years, he was knighted by King Charles II and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. It was a transformation so abrupt that even Morgan himself seemed unsure how to wear the title. The same man who had burned Panama now dined with planters and judges, presiding over the colony he had once treated as a launching pad for war. Yet beneath the titles and formalities, he never truly changed. The island's merchants still visited him for letters of marque, and the privateers who haunted Port Royal still called him Admiral. He lectured them on loyalty and restraint, but everyone knew the truth. Without men like them, the empire he served would have no teeth. The Caribbean remained a frontier ruled as much by rum and gunpowder as by law. The Spanish never recovered their confidence. They rebuilt Panama City further down the coast, but the new walls were lower, the streets narrower, the ambition dimmed. Traders began favoring English and Dutch ports, where the taxes were lighter and the patrols more dependable. Over time, English Jamaica became the hub of Atlantic commerce, while Spain's treasure fleets shrank and scattered. The blow Morgan had struck was not just military, it was psychological. It told the world that the Spanish Empire, for all its gold and glory, could bleed. The irony was that Morgan's own life mirrored the empire he had humbled. The longer he ruled Jamaica, the more his body betrayed him. Years of excess caught up quickly. The heavy drinking, the fevers, the wounds that had never healed properly. He became a symbol of the very decadence he once exploited, a living contradiction, both conqueror and captive of his appetites. In his final years, he withdrew from the public eye, his estates managed by others, his mind wandering back to the jungles of Panama. When he died in 1688, the island declared an official day of mourning. He was buried with military honors at Palisado's cemetery overlooking Kingston Harbor, cannons firing in salute. Not long after, an earthquake struck Port Royal and sent half the city sliding into the sea. Locals whispered that Morgan's restless spirit had claimed what the ocean had been waiting for. His legend, however, refused to sink. To English writers, he became a folk hero, the embodiment of cunning, courage, and national destiny. To the Spanish, he was a devil, proof of Protestant treachery. And to the generations of sailors who followed, he was something else entirely, a blueprint. They studied his tactics, his use of deception and speed, his ability to turn small ships into weapons against fleets 10 times their size. In the early 18th century, when piracy exploded across the Atlantic, many of its leaders, Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Charles Vane, invoked Morgan's name as inspiration. What he began as a private war became, within a generation, a global epidemic. Empires responded the only way they knew how, by turning pirates into cautionary tales. London outlawed privateering and hung its former heroes at the docks. The Spanish crown redoubled its fortifications and filled its galleons with Marines. Yet the damage was already done. Morgan had shown that one man, given the right moment and the right cause, could bend the balance of power. He had blurred the line between sanctioned war and personal enterprise so completely that even governments struggled to define where loyalty ended and greed began. Historians later debated his motives. Was he a patriot fighting for England's rise, or merely a thief cloaked in royal permission? The truth lies somewhere in between. Morgan was both product and architect of his age, a man shaped by empire, yet unbound by it. He understood that in a world ruled by distance and delay, the first to act held the advantage. Every raid he led was calculated not just for plunder, but for message. Each captured port announced that Spain could be reached, and each victory convinced London that the Caribbean could be theirs. His life became the argument for expansion, a justification for empire built ironically on piracy. The map of the Atlantic by 1700 bore his fingerprints. English settlements stretched from the Bahamas to Barbados. Naval bases dotted the Lesser Antilles. Trade routes once closed by Spain now ran openly under the Union Jack. Even the idea of naval professionalism, the concept that small, disciplined crews could outmaneuver grand armadas, owed something to Morgan's improvisations. His legacy lived in the Royal Navy's doctrine as much as in its myths. But perhaps his most enduring contribution was psychological. He turned fear into theater. His enemies saw him not merely as a raider, but as a specter, unpredictable, omnipresent, capable of striking anywhere. That perception persisted long after his death, giving birth to the archetype of the pirate captain, bold, ruthless, and oddly charismatic. When novelists in later centuries wrote of sea rogues who defied kings and carved their own destinies, they were retelling Morgan's story in disguise. Even Hollywood's romanticized pirates owe their swagger to him more than to any other figure. And yet, stripped of legend, his achievements remain a paradox. He fought to expand an empire that would, in time, condemn his methods. He enriched himself through plunder yet died surrounded by debts. He rose through daring and deceit, only to end his days as part of the establishment he once mocked. History remembers him because he stood at the crossroads between eras, the dying age of Spanish dominion and the birth of English naval supremacy. His raids did not merely enrich a nation, they shifted the gravity of global power. By the end of the 17th century, the Caribbean had become the world's laboratory for empire, its ports, test beds for trade, slavery, and military innovation. Morgan had forced the transformation. The English who followed turned his conquests into colonies, his outposts into plantations, his captured harbors into waypoints of a global network. The very chaos he unleashed became the foundation of a new order. Today his name still divides historians. To some, he was the harbinger of modern capitalism, a man who treated warfare as business, investing in risk and profit with terrifying efficiency. To others, he was simply a pirate elevated by circumstance, his fame exaggerated by the enemies he humiliated. But even his harshest critics admit one thing: no single man of his time altered the course of imperial power so dramatically. When Spain counted its losses after Panama, it was not the gold that mattered most, but the realization that faith and fear alone could no longer secure its dominion. The empire never expected that lesson to come from a pirate. It never imagined that one outlaw, armed with borrowed ships and borrowed men, could expose its fragility to the world. But history is rarely written by the powerful alone. Sometimes it is carved into the planks of burning ships, whispered across the seas by those who refuse to kneel. And in that sense, Henry Morgan remains undefeated. His victories ended centuries ago, yet the world he helped create, the world of ambition without borders, of commerce disguised as conquest, still sails beneath his shadow.